old NATO. We need NATO to protect us from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's collapsed. Oh, so what are NATO doing now? Surely they're not just brokering arms deals. They must be protecting us from something, mustn't they? Hello there, you 5.7 million awakening wonders. Thank you for joining me on this great march towards the truth. Together, unified in spite of differences, is the only way we can proceed. With tolerance, with the willingness to listen to the opposing views of people that we disagree with, we can combine and confront the only power that matters: centralized economic and financial power, using the state as its machine in order to control ordinary people, no matter how they look, no matter how they worship, no matter how they feel. We are those people. We are the people, and this is the time for us to combine. I chatted to Aaron Maté, the journalist. He explained to me how NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, or whatever it is they're called, actually, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have had to find new ways to pass their time now that there's not the old Cold War to contend with. And guess what they've been doing? Surely it's not something as cynical as brokering arms deals for various European or former Eastern Bloc nations. It couldn't be that, could it? Could it? Well, have a look and stay to the end of the video. This is one of them videos that you're going to be more intelligent at the end of than you are now. Even though I know you're clever already, I'm not putting you down. I believe in you. Hey, turn on the notification bell right now so that you know every day when we release these videos, just in case the algorithm turns against us. Stay to the end of this chat. You're going to love it. Of course, you don't like to generalize because you are a diligent and assiduous journalist, and it's clear that you have a pretty meticulous work ethic. But when I listen to people that have done the graft that you have done, I do find myself sort of pursuing an internal circuit that leads back to the position that I've held since I was about sort of 16, that the function of the US government, the UK government, globalist entities like the WEF, WHO, IMF, etc., while it might explicitly be about representing people or regulatory bodies that create opportunity for safety or create opportunity for trade, it always seems like this is at the service of global corporations and big business, and they'll essentially do whatever's necessary, including war, creating humanitarian crises, ignoring obvious solutions, denigrating the interests of their domestic population. Like it don't matter. It's essentially just true. You could start with something that would be commonly regarded as a sort of, inverted commas, a conspiracy theory, and then, you know, if you're willing to do the work such as you have done, you can show the sources, the strategy, and the historic and current reality of those beliefs.
Yeah, listen, I totally agree. And you can take any issue and see plenty of evidence for what you're talking about. I mean, take NATO expansion. NATO was created to counter the Soviet Union. Soviet Union ceased to exist at the start of the 1990s. Why does NATO still exist, and why is NATO still expanding? Well, a good hint for why is if you look at when NATO was heavily expanded at the end of the 1990s, when the US Senate was to vote on the ratification of expanding NATO, the US weapons industry poured in tens of millions of dollars in lobbying money. It was one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, lobbying frenzies ever. Why does the arms industry care so much about expanding NATO? It's not about, they don't, you know, Russia, the Soviet Union no longer exists. So what is this about? It's a market for them. Having all these new states in NATO means that all these states are obligated to be up to NATO standards, which means buying the weapons of NATO manufacturers, predominantly the US. And those are the interests behind all this. Even if it accelerates our race to destruction, even if it heightens the risk of nuclear war between the world's top nuclear powers, these are all subordinate to the higher goals of profit and hegemony. If you look at what the US has been doing under Trump, things got so crazy that while Democrats were constantly hyperventilating that he was controlled by Vladimir Putin and being blackmailed with P-tapes, Trump's actual policies, because Trump appointed a bunch of neocons, including Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, was to ratchet up tensions with Russia. And he did that by killing really vital nuclear arms control treaties that were reached during the Cold War that limited the nuclear weapon stockpiles of both countries. Predominantly the INF, or especially the INF treaty, which was reached in the 1980s between Reagan and Gorbachev. It eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons. Trump killed that treaty. If you look at the US media, it was barely reported because the media was more interested in encouraging Trump to be more confrontational with Russia, because that could then dispute claims that he was Vladimir Putin's puppet. So we live in a sociopathic society, and unfortunately, that those sociopaths are running our world.
The idea that NATO could be perceived not as a body to create peace and to organize treaties between potentially competing nations and to stabilize a previously unstable region, but essentially a brokerage for arms sales. So, sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it also sounds like it's true. It sounds like that's what you've just described is closer to the ideology that dominates global politics and global finance systems, and they're there to help everyone, which I don't sort of see too much evidence of. You talked about I know you got yourself into a bit of a jam around Russiagate, I suppose, by honestly reporting and dissenting against the dominant view. But what do you feel about that now? The way that Trump's allegiance with Putin was presumed to be true, the way that the way that it was supported by social media and mainstream media. What does that tell us about the relationship between corporate media, blue chip media, legacy media, whatever you want, blue church media, call it what you will, and our current power structures? What did it tell us, Aaron?
Well, to me, Russiagate was a scam, and it was a scam that worked beautifully for pretty much everybody in power, politics, media, and the national security state. And it hurt everybody else, including, I think, helping to fuel the current crisis that we're in with Ukraine. It started with the Clinton campaign, who generated these fake allegations of a sprawling Trump-Russia conspiracy, P-tapes being used to blackmail Trump by Putin, secret meetings with Russian hackers in Prague between Trump associates. All that was complete fiction, concocted by a British former intelligence officer named Christopher Steele. And when they lost the election, and this is documented, they immediately met in their Brooklyn headquarters and decided that instead of just, acknowledging that Hillary Clinton was a unlikable candidate for many people, had a terrible record, that they were going to blame Russia, and they were going to center this conspiracy theory that there was something going on between Vladimir Putin and Trump. So they had a motive there that instead of doing honest reflection about the terrible neoliberal legacy, not just of the Clintons, but of Barack Obama as well, and why so many people in the swing states decided to vote for this clown, Donald Trump, who was pretending to be a working class champion. Instead of doing some honest self-reflection, they decided to blame Russia and blame a fantasy they had about a Trump-Russia conspiracy. That converged with elements of the national security state, who also didn't like Trump, not because they cared that Trump is a racist or a sexist, but because he's an embarrassment. He was not a suitable steward of the U.S. empire. He said the wrong things. He blurted out the truth sometimes. He talked about the U.S. being killers when he ordered U.S. troops to stay in Syria after he initially tried to pull them out. He said, we're there to take the oil. You're not supposed to say that when you're the U.S. president. You're supposed to say, we're there to spread freedom and democracy. You're supposed to say stuff like that. You're supposed to be like Barack Obama, come up with fancy words and make people feel as if they're all progressive and liberal and enlightened while still keeping U.S. hegemony running smoothly. They also didn't like that he was talking on the campaign trail about getting along with Russia. And he also was even critical of U.S. interventions abroad, like in Syria and Libya. He was talking about, instead of ruining other countries, we're going to take care of our own. Now, I don't think Trump had any actual sincere intent to do that. But what scared people inside the FBI and the CIA was that his message had an appeal. And so the way to undermine his message is to stigmatize it by basically painting him to be a dupe of Russia and everything he says being the product of Russian disinformation and Russian influence. So that was the interest of the national security state. And that converged with the corporate US media, which helped get Trump elected by giving him billions of dollars worth of free airtime. And they're owned by the same people who run the country, who also saw Trump as an embarrassment and wanted someone more efficient like Barack Obama. And they stood to gain by blaming Russia for Trump's victory, because to look honestly at why Trump won would mean looking at what a dysfunctional country the U.S. is, and who has a bigger role in U.S. dysfunction, the people who control the country. So for them to look honestly at the reasons for Trump's victory would have meant to look at their own economic policies and foreign policies. They don't want to do that. So everybody had a convergence of interest in blaming Russia and centering on this Trump-Russia conspiracy theory, which, by the way, completely displaces the population from doing anything about Trump's actual policies. Because if the answer to Trump is simply that Robert Mueller is going to come and save the day, then no one needs to be involved at all in trying to change the country and fighting back against Trump being a real resistance. And that's why I like to point out that during the Trump era, there were bigger liberal protests to save the job of Jeff Beauregard Sessions, who was a racist Republican who was Trump's attorney general when he was fired by Trump, than there were to save Obamacare or to protest Trump's tax cuts. And that's because when Sessions was fired, MSNBC and CNN started freaking out that this meant that maybe Robert Mueller would be shut down. So the whole thing about standing up to Trump and protecting democracy was actually completely anti-democratic and really aimed at protecting privilege. And that's why I call Russiagate essentially a privilege protection racket.
Well, do you understand the NATO situation a little bit better? Things that I say that sometimes sound like mad conspiracy theories that I can't believe I'm saying out loud. When you talk to an investigative journalist who has done the work, you begin to appreciate that there are truths there that help you join together the dots of how power truly operates. All these global organizations that say they're there to help to improve your convenience or your safety or your security, whose convenience, whose safety, whose security are they really interested in? Let me know in the comments what you think about the IMF, the WEF, the WHO, all of them little three-letter situations. And NATO, one extra letter, basic same function, it seems to me. Certainly it does from listening to Aaron, but who cares what I think? It matters what you think is important. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, have a look at either one of these saucy little devils. They're absolutely fantastic. And also, join up to my mailing list. We have weekly online meetings. We do all sorts of live events that are absolutely fantastic. And in the event the algorithm ever jogged us on, we will be able to communicate with you directly. Stay free.